Holy shit. They did it. They actually did it. Let me start by saying something that I just want to say right out of the gate. Mimic Madness is my favorite episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. Not my favorite episode of the modern era, favorite of the post-modern era, not my favorite of season 10 or whatever. Mimic Madness is my favorite episode of the show, period. Not only that, but after years and years of clamoring that SpongeBob has gone down the drain, and it felt like it was just gonna sink lower and lower, it feels like SpongeBob is back. At the time of this review, SpongeBob is in a weird mix of season 10 and 11. But let's go back to season 9 for a minute. It was an interesting season of SpongeBob. Even before Hillenburg returned, people had claimed that it was a major bump in quality compared to previous seasons. I mean, this is ignoring that anything is an improvement compared to season 6 and 7. I personally had been skeptical of this claim, to put it lightly. Episodes like Squid Baby, Little Yellow Book, and the abysmal SpongeBob You're Fired didn't bode too well. And each of those 3 episodes do line up in my top 10 worst episodes of the series. But I went past those outliers, and I looked through the season episode by episode. And yeah, ignoring the fewer bad episodes, it was definitely an improvement compared to previous seasons. Many of the episodes from the first half of the season made it into my top 25 favorite modern SpongeBob episodes. I thought that Safe Deposit Krabs was really funny, Plankton's pet was really sweet and heartwarming, and I thought that Patrick Man was one of Patrick's more tolerable appearances. The show was getting better, but it still didn't line up with the original run. No one ever expected that it ever would. Not to mention that things were rather quiet as Nickelodeon stretched the season over many years while they worked on the sequel, A Sponge Out of Water. We weren't getting too many episodes. Season 9 started, well, before I did, and I started back in 2013. And then something happened. Steven Hillenburg returned to the show. Technically, he had never left, as he had always been a creative consultant on the show, but his amount of involvement after the first movie and before the second is debatable. I mean, when you're talking about episodes like Waiting or Atlantis SquarePants, it feels like the people who were directly involved in making the episode weren't involved in making the episode. And it's not like SpongeBob's decline was instantaneous. We had to get through episodes like Good Neighbors and The Gift of Gum before we started getting episodes like The Splinter or One Course Meal. But after this return, I noticed an improvement almost immediately. It was slightly gradual. The episode Lost in Bikini Bottom, the first episode of the return, definitely felt like the older cast getting used to things once again, and trying on the characters as it were. Because you have to keep in mind that it wasn't just Hillenburg that worked on SpongeBob and made it great in its golden era. For instance, one of the returning writers was Kaz, who had worked on both Camp Lazlo and Phineas and Ferb in the meantime. Both shows that I liked. And yes, I actually like Camp Lazlo. It seems to be getting a bum rap as of late, and I'm not entirely sure why. He was one of the writers in the original 3 seasons of SpongeBob. And even beyond all of this, no one person makes a show great or makes it fail. It takes a team. Sometimes it's the entire original team and only the original team that makes it work. Sometimes that's not the case at all. Some new people can adapt to it. But very soon after Sponge Out of Water, I noticed that the characters were returning to their old selves, to put it lightly. It wasn't just that Patrick was no longer destroying everything out of sheer stupidity. In later season 9 and in season 10, he felt much more friendly. Krabs' greed was reeled in very much. Sandy was much less of the unethical scientist. Do you know what I think the main change is overall? Season 9 and 10 are a lot less mean-spirited. Like, a lot less. Mean-spiritedness kind of defined the darker seasons of SpongeBob. No pun intended. Episodes would frequently go out of their way to give a character as much torment as possible, whether or not they deserved it, whether or not it was funny. The world often seemed to turn against a singular character for no good reason. What passed for jokes became absolutely brutal, like the ending of Gone, the suicide jokes in Are You Happy Now, or the entirety of One Course Meal. It's not like the first 3 seasons of SpongeBob completely avoided this. Although the episodes that did go in this direction usually ended up being my least favorites of the post-movie era. I'm with Stupid being the standout example. But in season 6 and 7, this got especially the case. Well, season 6 was more gross, but season 7 was the biggest in this direction. Now, I don't need a cartoon to be all sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. From experience, that's not the most enjoyable thing either. But it can get tiring to watch a world of assholes constantly tormenting each other. Especially if it isn't funny. Especially if they were once some of the cheeriest, even most optimistic characters in animation. I mean, Mr. Krabs, for all of his greed, he shouldn't be on the same moral level as, say, Rick Sanchez. They're not the same kind of show. In seasons 9, 10, and I guess 11 now, it seems like the characters are much more human. Yes, I know the irony of saying that when they're all fish. What I mean is they feel more like characters. That's the best way to say it. There's one episode where Mr. Krabs spends the entirety trying to get Squidward out of the picture, so his art will be valuable and he can collect the extra worth. And it kind of works, because they don't go for the mean-spirited tone that they did in earlier episodes like Good Neighbors. Let's call it the post-sequel era. Is it perfect? No, of course it's not. One problem that I have noticed immediately is that in season 9 and 10, they seem to be reusing a lot of ideas. SpongeBob You're Fired is the granddaddy of this, being nothing but a dozen other episodes thrown together in a blender, but including even the early season 9 episodes, Evil Spatula is a better version of All That Glitters. Food Con Castaways feels a lot like Club SpongeBob. Code Yellow feels like the absolute best way you could do an episode like Demolition Doofus. If you're wondering, in the episode Code Yellow, SpongeBob impersonates a doctor. I'm not misinterpreting anything, that's literally what he does. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that. This even does involve today's episode, Mimic Madness. Mimic Madness is like an amazing episode of Face Freeze, and I'm not the first person to notice this. Face Freeze, if you're wondering, was an episode that had such little substance that I almost couldn't review it. In that episode, SpongeBob and Patrick make stupid faces. Mr. Krabs tells them not to, then they do them anyway. Repeat for 11 minutes. And even then, it was kind of a ripoff of an earlier episode, Hooky. The thing is, using old ideas like this, it doesn't automatically make it a bad thing. Hell, if you could do these ideas better than they did in the past 10 years and actually make them good, then I don't mind it at all. And it's not like they aren't coming up with new ideas either. It just seems like they're relying on it a little bit too much. But if they keep making things like Mimic Madness, then it might be worth it. I don't know. I'm admittedly beating around the bush a little bit because Good SpongeBob is something fairly hard to talk about. On my top 25 list, for instance, I only briefly went over a few of them because it's really hard to talk about the nuts and bolts. It's really hard to talk about the nuts and bolts of most good comedy. I normally choose to talk about story. It's what I'm good at and what I surround my life with. And it's much easier to talk about to a general audience. Mimic Madness, though, like most SpongeBob episodes, is fairly light on the story. The basic plot is that SpongeBob imitates people. They like it at first, encouraging him. Then he starts annoying everybody with his imitations, but he can't stop, because he's come down with the mocking mimicry madness. SpongeBob is a comedy, and it's a minefield talking about jokes without, well, ruining them. With story, the more you watch it, generally your impressions of it don't change, but the more you hear a joke, the more it gets explained to you, the less chances are you're gonna like it, which is why I don't often talk about comedies on Admirable animation. Sure, I could tell you about all of the subtleties of the inflections, how it pops out of nowhere and becomes unexpected, thus humorous, and the absolute crazy facial expression, but that would probably harm the joke if you've never seen it before. And as they say, if you explain the joke, there is no joke. But one thing I can talk about is the animation here. If this was made in season 6, it probably would be a very bad episode, and a very gross one. The plot of this episode is SpongeBob imitating everyone, not just in voice, but in facial appearance too. And it looks really good, seeing SpongeBob in all of these interesting shapes. It's old quality charm with new high definition animation. Seems like a match made in heaven. Now, the high definition visuals aren't incredibly important. You can animate the Splinter as well as you want, you can put it in HD, but it's always gonna look like the Splinter. And you can give a piece of shit the best animation in the world and it's still gonna look like a piece of shit. However, in this episode it seems like they were well aware of how uncanny the animation could have come across. For much of this episode, we see faces fusing and SpongeBob becoming these contorted figures with a million eyes and weird appendages. Most of the time though, SpongeBob finds himself in rather humorous, defined shapes. And when he could come across as disturbing, it doesn't appear on screen for very long. You know, they're not tormenting the audience with a fungus for 11 minutes. I don't want to talk about this episode in those terms, though. It's easy to talk about how it's good in comparison to what it could have been. Anything is. And I can go on and on about the little touches that really only feel good if you've been burned by bad SpongeBob for a decade. For instance, the moment that Patrick reprimands Squidward and Plankton for insulting his friend. The fact that it stars all the main cast in its entirety, with the exception of, like, Mrs. Puff and Pearl. Or that despite Plankton and Krabs being in the entire episode, the formula is only actually mentioned in a quick gag. After all, if the show is doing what it was supposed to be doing, none of this would really matter in the slightest. So, let's talk about how the episode is good on its own. Actually, let's talk about how it's amazing on its own. And I suppose we could start by saying that Tom Kenny's vocal range in this episode is amazing. You could in fact almost argue that this episode was made just so Tom Kenny could show off his range. The best impression he does is definitely that of Patrick.
I'm gonna eat ice cream and go jellyfishing with my good buddy SpongeBob.
Sounds good to me.
It's just me, Patrick. Fooled ya.
Like, he sounds exactly like Patrick, to the point where I had to look it up to see if that was really Patrick's voice. Like, obviously he doesn't end up sounding exactly like all of the characters, but it's just damn impressive all in all. The most important aspect, though, is that this episode is funny. Like, really funny. It's not chocolate with nuts, but it's more than I've laughed at SpongeBob in a long time, and I don't think there's a dud joke in the entire episode. I can't find a particularly low moment or a moment where I wasn't smiling. When SpongeBob starts to get obnoxious about his mimicry, it's never obnoxious towards the audience either, and that's a very small tightrope to walk. A lot of the humor in this episode is reaction humor, which really works here. It's not just that SpongeBob ends up mimicking Plankton when he says that he's a freak, it's Plankton's reaction to it. I think that my favorite joke in the episode is when Sandy asks SpongeBob how many fingers he's holding up, and SpongeBob says B. That would be funny on its own, but then Patrick congratulates him, saying that he got the same answer, and that is hilarious. This is one of the first episodes in a long time that seems like it would be mimetic. You know, there are lines and such that can line up with things like advanced darkness, my leg, chocolate. I can't understate what kind of charm this episode has. It's something that I can't really articulate. I know it might be a little bit cliche to say this, but Mimic Madness does feel like an episode you could pull out of season 2 or 3, but with the advancements they have made over the years, namely with a bigger budget and better animation. But let's be completely honest. What cements this episode as my favorite is definitely the song.
Who am I? I just can't remember. Who am I?
I just can't recall. Who am I to sing this somber song? When you've got 6 heads, there's something wrong.
Who am I?
Please tell me.
Who am I?
Do you know me?
SpongeBob songs have had a complicated history over the years. I think that the most famous one is the one at the end of Band Geeks, which isn't really a SpongeBob song. But other than that, there are songs from Welcome to the Chum Bucket and The Sponge Who Could Fly. It's strange because even at the best of times, it's hard to tell why I like some of these earlier songs. The song Just a Greasy Spoon, for instance. It probably shouldn't sound as good as it does. Mr. Krabs' voice sounds extremely raspy, for instance. In most other contexts, it probably would come across as grating. And then there's SpongeBob's voice, which is designed to be a little bit annoying. I mean, he frequently annoys other characters for a reason. And in these earlier songs that people seem to love, his voice is technically the same as it is in the songs from Atlanta SquarePants, The Best Day Ever and To Love a Patty, songs that people tend to hate. I think the answer is passion. In Atlanta SquarePants, for instance, it doesn't sound like the characters care, and in that sense, the audience doesn't care. Yeah, I get it that I'm not supposed to take these plots seriously, but the characters are. When SpongeBob is forced to work at a new job, he sings like his life is destroyed, because to him, that is the case. And you're able to connect with that better. Not only does it make it more emotional, but on some level it actually does make it funnier. And here, SpongeBob is having a full-on identity crisis. Not his first, strangely enough, but his song here adds layers and layers of investment. In fact, if I didn't really think about it, this song probably would have made me forget entirely the fact that SpongeBob has done this whole I can't recognize myself kind of thing before. And not to mention, it just sounds so triumphant and happy.
Who am I?
I have a right to know.
Who am I? Am I friend?
Or foe?
I have so many features, it makes it hard to tell. I don't know what my first name is, but my face is ring a bell.
Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Who am I?
Who am I?
The emotion in this just oozes out charm. I can imagine the joke already. Why is this your favorite SpongeBob episode? Because the only one this thing oozes is charm. I don't want to say things like that though, because it would sound like I only liked it in comparison. Like, I could say that my favorite episode of Adult Party Cartoon is blah 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 because it's the least shit. And I don't want to say that about Mimic Madness because I do like it a lot. And I have been liking a lot of the newer episodes of SpongeBob. A lot. And I haven't really noticed any major stinkers in season 10 and 11. While I wouldn't put this as one of my favorite cartoon episodes of all time, and it doesn't raise SpongeBob to one of my absolute favorite cartoons of all time, like I said, I am a story guy, and that's what I mainly look for. This episode as a whole is just an absolute delight, and it kind of makes me feel like a kid again in a weird way. It's funny, it's well made, the song within sounds awesome, the characters are all familiar yet fun. What's not to like? And yeah, you can make jokes about SpongeBob having an identity crisis and not truly knowing who he is because of some less savory seasons, but who would do that?
Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Who am I?
Who am I? Hello?
Hello? To whom am I speaking?